Right. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Genesis Deep Dive Bible Study here at New Beginnings Christian Missionary Alliance Church in Poughkeepsie, New York. I'm Pastor House, and I'm glad to be with you for this study. Last Wednesday, we were planning to be together and do this passage, and it snowed, and it snowed, and it snowed, and no, it was about half an inch I got at my house. But I don't, when I'm here in Poughkeepsie, I just don't know how much you guys can tolerate. So I come from the Rochester area. That's where we've been living for 10 years before we came here. And before that, Connecticut and, the Utica area as well. And all those places are, 2 foot of snow is a decent drop. Poughkeepsie, 2-3 inches and everything shuts down. So for me, I can drive through anything. And but I don't want to force you guys to drive through it because
Roads were just wet.
they were just wet. Yeah, they were just wet. So I felt some Rochester-based shame for having canceled Bible study, but that was the best idea. So anyway, welcome back. And if you're joining us on YouTube, who knows? You might be watching us in the summer. It might be 2027. I don't know what year it is. Welcome to this Bible study tonight. We've got people on Zoom. We're glad to have everybody on Zoom. We've got people here in person, and of course we got our YouTube partners. And so let's pray and we'll dive into our Bible study tonight. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this evening. Thank you for your love for us. Thank you that in your love for us, you give us your word, you give us your spirit, and you give us one another. And Lord, I pray that tonight, as we study your word and the power of your spirit together, that wonderful things would happen, that we would see more in your word than we would see alone, that we would benefit from one another's eyes and hearts, and that we would be guided by your spirit to see the things you want us to see tonight, to learn the things you want us to learn, so that we can live the kind of lives that you're calling us to live, and we can trust in you with all our hearts. Lord, please bless this study tonight, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, we are trucking our way through the book of Genesis. I sat down, after our last study, I sat down with the entire book of Genesis, and I worked my way through it, the rest of it, and figured out that we do have enough weeks to finish the book of Genesis by the end of this semester or whatever, but I wanted to finish it before June, so we can finish in May, and we can do that. When I figured it out, we actually had 3 bonus Wednesdays. Now we have 2 because of that massive blizzard last week. So we do have some wiggle room there. What I'm going to be doing, and this is new for you, Mary, is that I'm going to be actually telling you what passage we're going to be studying week to week, so that we can focus our attention and do that. So our passage this week starts on page 74 of the manuscript, unless you're using the most recent version of the manuscript, in which case it might be a little bit later. But page 74, line 14. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him, was the last thing that we studied last time. So we're going to start our passage with, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed. That's where our passage is going to start. And if you page a couple of pages later, 3 pages later, to page 77, we're going to end page 77, line 7. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. It is very arguable that you could end it on the previous line, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. There's a lot of different places here you could end the passage. This one is a tricky one as to when sort of the thought unit is over, but we're in that neighborhood there, right? So if it's on page 77, line 7, so Joseph went out over the land of Egypt, I'm counting as the last line of our passage tonight. All right, we're doing manuscript Bible study, and as just a reminder of what that means, it means that we're we're using a text that is 8.5, printed on 8.5 by 11 paper. It is double spaced. It doesn't have chapter or verse markings. It does have line markings. If you're watching us on YouTube and you don't have a copy of the manuscript, send an email to church@newbeginningscma.org and we will send one to you. And it's free of charge. You can have the manuscript to do it. And our 3-step process in Bible study is to look, to listen, and then to live it out, right? So we spend the bulk of our time looking at what the passage actually says. As one of our core convictions is that it can only mean what it means because it says what it says, right? We're not just making meanings up. We're not just having it mean whatever we want it to mean. Whatever it means based on the words that are there. And the author, we believe it was inspired by God and that the Holy Spirit inspired the writing of even the very words, but we also believe that somehow there was a partnership between the Holy Spirit and the human author, and which probably was Moses or somebody a lot like Moses in Moses's day. And Moses, we'll call him Moses. Moses wrote what he wrote, trying to get a message across. And he did certain things to make sure that the message was communicated. And we've talked about this in the past. It's really great to look at things like repetition, cause and effect, repetition of themes, to look at surprising things, cause and effect for comparison and contrast, lists, numbers of things, general to particular, things like that, who, what, where, when, why, how. And we take a look at those things. We try to make note of those things by marking them down on our page. That's one of the reasons we use 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, so we don't feel like we're committing sacrilege by writing in our Bibles. But rather we circle things, we draw lines between things, we make boxes around things, whatever helps you to see what the author is trying to say. So to start off, just in case you didn't have time to this week or these 2 weeks to study this passage, I do want you to be familiar with the text. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to read it over, and we'll come back and then we will we'll spend some time looking at what it says. Please do use your pens or pencils or markers to look it over carefully, and in 5 minutes I'll have to close and we'll start talking about it. a lot going on here. It's a long passage. So I hope you had a chance to look at it. Now let's talk about what it says. So as you look at this passage, and let's focus just for the moment on page 74. What stood out to you? What did you notice?
First thing I noticed that it says after 2 whole years. So
Okay.
that's very specific. And then there are 5 and behold.
Okay, good. So 2 observations here. One is that it's after 2 whole years. So that's a good time reference. You remember last time at the when we were trying to delimit our passage, that was the main reason why we broke off just before this, because there was a huge time jump between the previous passage and this one. So 2 whole years go by. Why do you think it's important to the storyteller that we know that 2 whole years have passed?
Because the cupbearer forgot Joseph.
Yeah, right. And so the cupbearer had forgotten Joseph, and what does the fact that 2 whole years have passed mean for the story?
Well,
Because Joseph is in jail and he didn't do anything deserving to be in jail.
Yeah. I mean, it sure sort of stretches the idea that God is taking care of him, is going to do good things for him. During that 2 years, it's a faith stretching time. Now, we talked about it before. It's like 13 years worth of imprisonment that Joseph has suffered now since he was sold into slavery. So it's a long time. 2 years out of 13, it's not nothing, but it's a little bit more, and it's enough more that it's definitely a stressful thing. So after 2 whole years, the cupbearer has forgotten Joseph. And remember that we said last time that forgetfulness here is not a mental lapse; it's a moral lapse. Okay, remember and forget in this context are covenantal words. And we've said this with this in line 2 of page 74. Joseph asks the cupbearer, please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh. And kindness there is the most important word in the Old Testament, chesed, right? Chesed. It's a covenant word. He's calling the cupbearer to be part of a covenant with him. And remembering and forgetting are terms that are used in covenants. We talk about faithfulness to the covenant or unfaithfulness to the covenant. So the cupbearer has been unfaithful to the covenant for 2 whole years, 2 whole years of faithlessness by the cupbearer. And Bev points out that there's a repetition, and behold is all over this story. This is one of the Hebrew words that is most difficult to translate. That is translated behold oftentimes. Sometimes it's translated look. Sometimes it's translated more colloquially, you might say, hey, or wow, or some kind of utterance. It's in Hebrew, it's the word hine, H-I-N-N-E-H, if you're transliterating it into English. And it basically means, wowie zowie, or it's amazing, or whatever. It doesn't really have there's not really a word in English that translates it. It's supposed to point to sort of astonishment, right? It indicates that something is happening that is astonishing. And so there's a lot of astonishment on this page. Astonishing things are happening. Great. What else did you see?
Pharaoh's dream was like Joseph's first dream,
Okay.
where we triumphed over the strong, and they both involve grain.
Okay. Yeah. So we have an agricultural dream. In which the weak and the strong dynamic is kind of turned upside down, right? In Joseph's dream, way back when, at least 14 years earlier, Joseph had dreamed that that he had a sheaf of wheat that all the other sheaves of wheat bowed down to, right? That represented his father and his brothers and his mother. Well, here we have even more of a weak and strong dynamic. It's not just 12 bowing to one. This is 7 scrawny devouring 7 good. Yeah, and it's again, it has to do with grain, whether it's wheat or corn. It's still grain product, which is an interesting thing. So it has a lot of similarities to Joseph's dream. Yeah, very good. What else did you notice?
That was by the Nile River.
By the Nile River. Yeah. So talk to me about the Nile River.
Lifeblood of Egypt.
Lifeblood of Egypt. How so? What does that mean?
Well, that's when it flooded, it fertilized the fields.
Yeah. 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 So the Nile has that pattern. It was, yeah, it's like it's the thing that makes everything grow. Because you think about it, Egypt, a lot of Egypt is desert, right? There's a huge desert there in Africa. Now, it's not always been desert, but at different times it's been desert in Africa, big or small. And in a hot climate, the Nile made it so that the land was always fertile, right? The Nile would flood every season and water all the ground. And then when the water receded, that ground was very fertile and you could grow anything there. So, which makes what happens even more startling, right? This is a dream about famine. Egypt never had famines, never, because the Nile was what kept them.
And the Nile was also their drinking water.
It was also their drinking water, yeah. So it's their lifeblood. It's the water they drink. It makes sure that they have food to eat. It's no wonder that they actually saw the Nile as being a deity, right? The Nile was a god in itself. Yeah, very good. What else did you see?
I'm surprised they had cows,
Why?
because there's no mention in the Bible ever about like drinking milk or anything like
Yeah.
that.
Right.
Well, where did these cows come from?
Yeah. Good point. Yeah. So there is drinking of milk in the Bible. There's eating of cheese.
No milk
Usually
is
it's from
not-
goats. Yeah, in the Bible, it's usually from goats. Cows were not the normal source of milk or cheese for people in that area of the world. There is mention of cows in different places, but these cows are their dream cows. Yeah. So what do we learn about the cows and what do we learn about the ears of grain?
7.
They're all 7. 7 was mentioned 24 times.
Oh my goodness, okay. So we have 24 mentions of the number 7. Is that interesting? What's
Well, I found more interesting, there were 7 mentions of God and.
okay? All right, 24 mentions of 7 and 7 mentions of God. That's great. Yeah. God, as we've said in this in Genesis, when it says God with a capital G, lowercase od, it's usually translating the word Elohim, right? Which is sort of a generic word for God in that area of the world. It was a word that Egyptians would certainly understand, right? Yahweh, which is usually translated Lord, that was a personal name for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Egyptians would not have known that name, but they do know the name Elohim for sure. So yes, 7 is a huge number in the Bible. It's a huge number in the book of Genesis. And there was 7 days that the world was created in, for just one example. And here, there's going to be 7 years. The number 7 here refers to 7 years. But before we get to the interpretation of the dream, what are there 7 of in these dreams? 7 cows,
7 years.
and 7 ears of corn. But that's not exactly true, right? There's
7 years of grain. seven-
No,
And then
7 plump cows, 7 ugly cows.
yeah, so there's 7 plus cows and 7 minus cows. And there's 7 plus ears of corn and 7 minus ears of corn. Right, so there's 14 corn, I know how to spell corn. There's 14 of each. So there's 4 sets of 7 things, right? 7 cows, 7 plump cows, 7 skinny, ugly, thin cows. Yeah, I have a difficult time in my mind thinking what an attractive cow would be. But that's the word that's used, an attractive cow. Healthy, yeah, sort of sleek, beautiful, yeah. Interestingly, in Hebrew, some of the times, the nice words about the cows and the ears of corn, some of them are the word good. Not every time, but sprinkled throughout the descriptions of the cows and the ears of corn that look healthy. It just uses the word good to describe it. And some of the times when it's describing the skinny, withered, blasted ears of corn or the skinny, withered cows, it uses another word. Want to guess what the other word is that's used for the not so wonderful cows? Bad, yeah, evil. Yeah.
Easier.
Now, but why would I even mention this? Why is it important that there's a contrast between cows that are good and cows that are evil, or ears of corn that are good and ears of corn that are evil? Why would using those words ring a bell for people who are reading the book of Genesis? Maybe on Zoom have a theory? Why the contrast?
Well, it goes back to,
Oh, you're gonna have to try again because your connection didn't work out there.
it goes back to Adam and Eve and good and evil.
Yes. Okay. All throughout Genesis, there's been a contrast between good and evil. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? It talks about that Adam and Eve have become like one of us. God says, knowing the difference between good and evil, good and evil, good and evil. When those two words are contrasted to one another, it's typically trying to bring our memory back to one of the major themes of the book of Genesis, which is the contrast between good and evil. Now, good and evil are not always moral terms. Okay, this is not that there were cows that were doing kind deeds for one another. Okay, and so they were good cows. There weren't ears of corn that were hanging out behind the 7-Eleven smoking joints, okay, and robbing passers-by. They're not good and evil in moral terms, but they're good and evil in terms of accomplishing what God intends for them to accomplish. Right? God looks at everything that he has made in Genesis chapter 1, and he calls it good. Not morally good, right? He creates mountains and trees, right? Those mountains and trees are not immoral and moral, but they're good because they are accomplishing the purpose for which God put them there, right? They're fitting into place in God's plan. And so you look at these cows, you look at these ears of corn, and as a cow, it's a good cow. As a cow, it's a evil cow. It's a cow that's not doing what cows ought to do, right? You look at the same thing with the ears of corn, right? This is an ear of corn that is exemplary. This is the New York State Fair bushel of corn, right? You bring, oh, look at that, right? And that one, that's the ear of corn that, you know, you bought it dried in the grocery store as a decoration. You left it outside and the birds got at it, right? It's not in any way accomplishing the purposes that an ear of corn is to have. So good and evil are contrasted here. Very good. What else?
Question as to the cows and the good and the bad. I don't know if you were going to explain, but what's popping in my mind that why did God in the dream? Why did the cow swallow? Why swallow? Why the eating of one of the other and good and evil?
Yeah, yeah. What's that called when something eats something else of its own kind? It's cannibalism. Yeah, kind of a fun little thing there, right? These are cannibal cows and cannibal corn. I like caramel corn. I don't like cannibal. Why the cannibalism? Right? Why are the cows cannibals? Why are their ears of corn cannibals? Any thoughts?
Well, because all the good produce from those 7 good years are gonna be devoured in those 7 years, those bad years.
Yeah.
It's all gonna be eaten up by the people.
Yeah. And one of the things that Joseph says about the famine is that when the famine comes, everything, all the good years are going to be forgotten. Right? It's going to be so bad that you'll forget that you ever had it good. And that's what the cannibal cows and cannibal corns are all about. They're there to show that that these years of famine are going to be so severe that the years of plenty will be all but forgotten. It's that bad. Right? And you know what? That's just pretty common in our lives too, right? I mean, God does wonderful things in our life and we're, oh, yay, rejoice. And then something bad comes along, something that we don't like happens, we start to experience pain and we forget that we had it good just a week ago, right? Now we're like, whoa, is there really a God? You know, just last week, we were on cloud 9, we were giving worship, we were saying, oh, God is good, God is great, he's blessing me so much, I can see his hand in all that I do. And then the next week, you know, we have cancer. And we're like, is there really a God? You know, oh, the plenty that I just experienced, it's gone from my memory. I don't even remember it anymore. That's human nature, right? It's human nature. However, it's also human nature when blessing comes to forget the pain, which is a wonderful thing about it. With our memories of pain are distant once it passes by. What else did you notice?
Pharaoh's spirit was troubled on the dream.
Pharaoh's spirit was troubled. Let's turn the pages. We talked about this. We're on page 75, but yeah. So Pharaoh's spirit was troubled. What's up with that? What spirit was troubled? What else? Disturbed by the dream. Yeah. Yes. Right. He had two sessions of sleep. Maybe on the same night, maybe on 2 separate nights. We don't know, but he's troubled, just like the cupbearer and the baker were troubled because of their dreams in the previous story. Now, what did we say about Egyptians and interpreting dreams? What did Egyptians believe about the interpretation of dreams? Do you remember?
Oh, that is important.
It was very important because they believed that their dreams
Meant something.
Yeah.
It's gonna happen.
yeah, there were communications from beyond. And how did dream interpretation happen? How did that work in Egyptian society?
Through their magicians, wise men, and dream interpreters.
Right. So magicians, wise men, dream interpreters, and they used books, right? They had books of dream interpretation symbols, okay? If you dream about a raven, it means this. If you dream about a loaf of bread, it means that. If you dream about the Nile River, it means this. If, whatever, there was one-to-one correlation between what you dreamed and what it meant. And if you were trained in dream interpretation, you knew the content of these books, and you could point to the place in the books and say, well, this means that means this. And it was almost, I said last time, almost scientific approach to dreams, right? They did studies of dreams to try to figure out what these different symbols might mean. Last night I had a dream. This is true. Last night I had a dream where I was at a seminary. It wasn't a seminary that I went to, but I knew that it was a seminary. And like a bomb exploded at the seminary and wiped out half of the campus. A huge bomb. And so I actually had 2 dreams about this last night. Now, in the Bible, when you have 2 dreams about the same subject, it means that this is something the Lord is telling you and it's certainly going to happen. I don't think that's the case with my dream. In one of my dreams, it was a bomb that exploded. In another of my dreams, there was an aircraft flying overhead, and a super powered individual jumped from the plane, landed on the seminary, and the impact of their landing caused them to explode and wipe out half the seminary. My family wasn't there, so I called them on the phone to tell them about it. And my car was destroyed. I lost a bunch of friends, but in the dream, what was most important to me was my car was destroyed. So I tell this dream to Chris, the Egyptian dream interpreter, right? And Chris goes back to the book and he says, okay, a bomb exploding. What does that mean? In a seminary? Okay, it means this. Okay, a superpowered individual means that you have been eating too much vodka last night or whatever. I don't know. Do you eat vodka? Whatever you eat. And his book would tell him 1 for 1 what my dream meant. Right now, the cupbearer and the baker, when they were in the prison, their spirits were troubled, and they had a complaint. Right? Joseph goes to them. He says, "Why are you sad?" They said, "We've had dreams." And what do they say?
There's no one to interpret.
There's no one here to interpret it, right? There's no learned magician here. There's nobody who knows the books.
Right.
Is that Pharaoh's problem?
No,
No. Why not?
he's a pharaoh.
Right. What does he have?
He has everything.
He has everything.
Everybody.
There's lots of dream interpreters there, and his spirit is still troubled, right? Because they could not interpret Pharaoh's dream. I just want to circle this in our minds, right? That here were the smartest, most learned scientists of the day, right? Who studied this for a living. This is what they did. This was their expertise. And either they offered Pharaoh interpretations that he knew were wrong, right? Or they had nothing to tell. One or the other, right? In some way, if they had anything to say, it obviously wasn't sufficient, because Pharaoh said, nobody can interpret my dreams. Or they had nothing to say. Either way. So Pharaoh is up the Nile without a paddle, right? Yeah. What else did you notice? We're on page 75 now. What else did you notice?
Cupbearer remembered his offenses against God.
Okay.
Remember,
Okay, so say that again?
by not remembering to
Yeah.
plead his case before the Pharaoh.
He said, I remember my offenses. Okay, what is he talking about when he talks about his offenses? They
Not
say,
keeping a covenant that he made with Joseph.
right, so one stream of this is, I broke faith with Joseph. Definitely. There's one other stream to this, though, that makes this maybe a dangerous thing for the cupbearer to say to Pharaoh.
why he was thrown in there in the first place.
Yes, okay. Why was he thrown in jail? Now, we
For
know,
some kind of offense, but they never said what it was.
exactly, yeah. So Bev, he's remembering his offenses here. Maybe he's talking also about whatever got him in prison. He's probably thinking about his offense against Joseph. But there's the danger that what Pharaoh might remember is, wait a second, I was angry with you and threw you in jail. But don't bring that up. You know, so there's no risk for him here in saying that, right? I remember my offenses today. Now, we do remember, of course, that the cupbearer was restored to his position, which indicates that Pharaoh doesn't think he's guilty of whatever he was charged of. Because if the cupbearer was guilty of trying to assassinate Pharaoh, which we were talking about in the last passage as a possibility, because the baker is killed for whatever.
Right, by admitting he's remembering his offenses, he's kind of like admitting he committed it.
Maybe, or maybe putting a seed of doubt in Pharaoh's mind.
Yeah.
You know, but he's certainly talking about breaking faith with Joseph. But there's the danger that Pharaoh could take it the wrong way. So there's a risk for the cupbearer here.
Which is why he probably never said anything to begin it when it just came out.
It might be.
He wanted to forget the whole, I almost died kind of a thing.
Yeah, it might be. It was a dangerous thing for him to bring this up. And maybe he didn't see Joseph's life as important enough to him to take that risk until today. Until today. So as I don't want to be too down on the cupbearer, because he does eventually come out, right? And say, talk about it. Yeah, what else did you see?
To me, it seems like with Joseph interpreting this in the next step, it's like a sense of urgency. It says, let Pharaoh now
Okay,
proceed.
where are you? Page 76?
Yeah, page 76.
All right, so let's stay on 75 for now. Let's stay on 75 just so that we talk about this part before we move on. We will move on there and hang on to that. It's a good observation. What else do you see on 75?
Well, he tells Pharaoh about the dream, the interpretation, how they came true, and he says there's a young Hebrew down there. And so Pharaoh sent and called it, and they brought him up out of the pit.
Up out of the pit.
Out of the pit, which reflects back to when he was first thrown back in the pit by his brothers.
Yeah, good. So this word pit has been a very important word in Joseph's story so far, right? He was thrown into the pit. He was pulled up out of the pit to be sold into slavery. And when he went into prison, he describes it as a pit. Even though it's not, right? It's not the pit. Word pit talks about an empty cistern, right? Lined of stones to gather water when it rains. But he's using that as a metaphor for what happened to him when he was in prison. So he's brought up out of the pit. The cupbearers, the gist of what the cupbearer says is Joseph can interpret dreams. Right? I'm putting it in quotes, although that's not exact words that he says, but that's the gist of what the cupbearer says. Joseph can interpret dreams. Pharaoh talks to Joseph and says, I've heard you can interpret dreams. And Joseph says, I can't do it. Yeah, right. Joseph's answer is, no, I can't interpret dreams. God can interpret dreams, right? So Joseph says, God can interpret dreams. So Joseph has a different view of what's going on than the cupbearer does, and then Pharaoh does. Now, why would it be interesting to tell Pharaoh that God can interpret dreams? Why is that important for Pharaoh to know that God can interpret dreams? Who's Pharaoh?
Well, he's an Egyptian, so he wouldn't believe in.
He's an Egyptian God. He's an Egyptian who believes that he's God. Yeah, this is the thing. I mentioned that the word Elohim is a generic word for God. Any God qualifies as an Elohim, right? Pharaoh was considered by the Egyptians to be the son of Ra, the sun god, right? The sun deity. And so Pharaoh is an incarnation of the Spirit of God. And Joseph says to Pharaoh, God can interpret dreams, which means you're not him, right?
That was kind of-
Yeah, right? I mean, on one hand, you have the theology of Joseph saying, this all comes from God, but that implies that Pharaoh isn't God. Just like when in the New Testament, the creed of the early church was Jesus is Lord, right? Jesus is Lord in a society where to be a citizen of the Roman Empire, you had to swear that Caesar is Lord, right? If you swear that Jesus is Lord, you are implicitly saying Caesar is not, right? And so for Joseph to tell Pharaoh that God can interpret dreams, he's implicitly saying you're not God. And
A favorable answer. God will
Yeah,
give
that's
Pharaoh a favorable.
God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Let's talk about that. Favorable answer. Favorable answer. Basically saying, we'll give you the answer that will help you. An answer that will help you, a good answer. Because he's going to tell him something that's not all that pleasant, right? He's not telling him everything's going to be hunky-dory. What he's telling him is things are going to be really, really bad. Is that a favorable answer? Yes, it is a favorable answer because you're going to be able to prepare for it. Okay? So favorable doesn't necessarily mean that the things he's talking about will be pleasant, but it does mean that it will be the answer Pharaoh needs. God will give you the answer that you need. So Pharaoh reiterates his dream. He tells his dream to Joseph, and there's some minor differences here, right? He talks about how I've never seen cows like that in all the land of Egypt. He says that if once the cows had eaten them, you would never know that they'd eaten them because they were still as ugly as at the beginning, right? So there's a few extra details that he throws in as he tells it to Joseph, but he says, I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me.
Yeah, because even after the thin cows eat the other cows, they're not gonna gain weight.
Right.
It's still gonna be fattened.
Right. And part of me is jealous. I think that's a great metabolism for this cow. But yeah, no, yeah. So and that's again, that's going to refer to those 7 lean years that are going to wipe out even the memory of the abundant. Yeah. So let's now go to page 76, and we'll talk about stuff on page 76. Does anybody have anything to talk about on page 76? Yeah.
Joseph goes ahead and reveals what God has, the dream, what God has revealed to Pharaoh. He doesn't plead his case, he just goes ahead and interprets the dream to Pharaoh.
So he's not
And
asking
he
Pharaoh,
invites him,
not asking Pharaoh to take it, turn him loose.
right, doesn't plead his cause, he just tells him what the dream means and tells him what he should do about it.
Yeah, which is a little cheeky.
Yeah.
So Joseph's confident enough to say, here's the interpretation and here's what you should do about it, right? He isn't taking the authority of this on his own, right?
He's saying it's fixed by God.
Yeah, 4 times in this interpretation section, he's been saying God, right? God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. God has shown to Pharaoh what he's about to do. It's been fixed by God. God will shortly bring it about. He's been emphasizing that this is from God. This dream is from God, and God wants to tell you what's going to happen. And so here's what you should do about it. Yeah, and Nicole, you had an observation here on page 76.
No, it was just going back to 76, then kind of 76 when we were talking about what the Pharaoh was saying to Pharaoh. But one of the things I've noticed also is that he had told Pharaoh that Joseph was the servant of the captain of the guard, which to me said that he was put in a certain position even in prison. So I think the cupbearer was saying, whatever he says can be trusted in, not to mention when he interpreted our dreams, it came to pass.
Yeah,
So he's of some reputation that you could take whatever he's saying as.
good, good, good. Yeah,
Does it matter that, when Joseph interpreted the cupbearer's dream, he asked him to mention it to Pharaoh to get him out of jail,
yeah,
but this time, he doesn't say anything about getting out of jail.
no, true, it's true. What do you think, Eddie?
Oh, I don't know, if he's just so confident that, I don't know, that doesn't make sense though.
I think he's trusting in God so much that he has faith that he's gonna be delivered.
Yeah, yeah,
Because he-
his
because he
dreams were
watched-
interpreted for him.
He's brought up out of the pit and washed and cleaned. And he receives his fourth change of clothes. throughout the whole
another change of clothes.
And by the end of the story, he's into his fifth change of clothes.
Yeah,
And he's still back in second in command of, again, first it was under Jacob. And then it was under Potphrey, and then now he's second in command again under Pharaoh.
we'll get there in a second. Nicole, you had something you were saying.
No, I was just saying. To carry or to tie into everything was that before all of this, Joseph had dreams that were that were told to him what it meant.
Yeah.
So I think also in the back of his mind, he's saying. Fulfillment is happening.
Yeah,
Because he was a man of God.
yeah,
So he was, which is why I think he didn't get all too. Like he just, like you said, he just did it without any, I don't think he did it and then, he just said.
Yeah.
He just did it.
they just did it. Yeah, at least Joseph can see which way the wind is blowing here, right? He knows I think Joseph here knows what's going to happen. This is it, okay? I had those dreams when I was a kid. They're about to come true, and he doesn't have to force it. He can just sort of say, okay, here's what's going to happen. Here's what I'm about to do. Here's what God's about to do. And here's what I recommend that you do about it. And, there's no need for him to push because Pharaoh is going to come to that conclusion on his own, that he should free Joseph.
Always God's time.
Yeah. All right, so what else? Anybody on Zoom? Observations on page 76. Any of our Zoomers? Not seeing anybody unmute. So anybody in the room, anything that you want to further observe on 76? Yeah, cool.
Especially Joseph said, let Pharaoh take 1/5. That to me, it wasn't multiple times he said it, but he could have stayed and take 1/4, 1/2, but he said 1/5.
Okay, yeah,
It
interesting.
was a specific amount that Pharaoh was to put aside.
So let's do some math here. I don't have any idea where we're going with this. So I'm not driving at a point here, but I think it's interesting. And when I've thought about this, I thought about it, I never put it on paper, but he's gonna take 1/5 of the produce in year 1, 1/5 year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, year 6, and year 7 of the years of plenty. Okay. So these are bumper crop years. Okay, so it's 1/5 of like, I don't know, 150% of normal or 200% of normal, who knows? But it's 1/5 of a large amount. But even so, he's collecting enough for 7 years of famine. He's going to over collect. He's planning to over collect above the needs of the people during those 7 years. Now, is he going to deprive people of food during the years of plenty? Yeah.
No, but I think during the years of collecting, they're not gonna be getting the abundance of, it's like you're saving.
Yeah.
So, I mean, cause I'm sure the Egyptians, they were used to plenty and lush and lavish, drinking of wines and stuff. So, I mean, if they were to continue on the same trend, I mean, what would be left? for the family?
Because there's a bumper crop, taking 20% of it isn't going to hurt them during the years of plenty. But during the years of famine, having that much is going to be necessary to provide for the entire land and beyond. One of the things we're going to learn, and haven't gotten there yet, but one of the things we're going to learn is that everybody from all the lands is going to come to Egypt to buy corn. So he is getting enough so that there's going to be sufficient for not just Egyptians to eat, but also everybody else in other lands. Very good. What else?
Pharaoh recognized that the spirit of God was in Joseph.
Okay. This is very important. Okay, so I'm just gonna say it right up here. Spirit of God. Pharaoh recognizes that in Joseph is the spirit of God. In Hebrew, this is the Ruach Elohim. Okay, Ruach, if you've been a Christian for a while, you've heard sermons about how Ruach means either spirit or breath, right? It can mean either one. There is one other place in Genesis where Ruach Elohim appears. Only one other place where the phrase Spirit of God is used. Does anyone think back? Can anyone come up with the one other place where the Spirit of God is mentioned in the book of Genesis?
Hovering over the waters.
Yeah, good job, Lynn and Jim, right off the bat there. The Spirit of God is hovering over the waters at creation, right? This is a key callback, right? Key callback here. We're connecting back to page 1 of our manuscripts, right? Line 2. The Spirit of God who created the world is at work in Joseph, right? Ah, it is mighty. It's a mighty thing, right? So that's a pretty cool thing. Yeah, all right. So the author of Genesis wants us to know that this is all connected, right? That the person who created the universe is active in Joseph at this time. That's important. Now, I mean, Pharaoh is the one who says it. Yeah, so that's key too, right? Pharaoh recognizes that this is the case. Pharaoh, who is supposed to have the Spirit of God inside him, right, recognizes that the Spirit of God is in Joseph, right? And no matter what Joseph has said before about Pharaoh, or whatever implication of Pharaoh not being God, Pharaoh is not vindictive here. He's treating Joseph with wisdom. So what does he do? What does he do for Joseph?
Makes him second in command.
Makes him second in command. Yeah, he's put over his house, put over my house, which is interesting, right? Interesting phrase. What's Joseph? Joseph's not going to be running Pharaoh's household, but what's interesting is that this phrase, being put over my house, is exactly what was said about Joseph in Potiphar's house.
Yeah.
And actually it was what was said of Joseph in prison. They actually used the word house in prison that Joseph was put over. So Joseph 3 times has been put over the house. And first it was over the house of his master, Potiphar. Second, it was over the house of the prison. And now it's over the house that is the entire land of Egypt. The entire land of Egypt is described here as a house. That's pretty incredible. And so he becomes the second in command. He was the second in command to Potiphar. He was the second in command in the prison, and now he's the second in command over all of Egypt. And there's, just like Potiphar reserved one thing that Joseph didn't have authority over, his wife, right? But for Potiphar, here Pharaoh reserves one thing, his throne, that Joseph does not have. This is the thing that distinguishes us. You're not Pharaoh, but other than that, you have the authority. Turning to page 77, there's a bunch of things that happen to Joseph. Puts a signet ring on Joseph's hand, gives him, as Chris pointed out, gives him another change of clothes, puts a gold chain around his neck, made him ride in the chariot, and had people call out, bow the knee before him. Archaeologically, as we look at archaeological finds from the land of Egypt, there are many documents that indicate this was sort of standard practice when Pharaoh elevated someone to a high position. You know, we do things a little differently. We might have a motorcade rather than a chariot, right? We have somebody put their hand on a Bible and swear an oath when they take a high office, right? There's an inauguration ceremony, but this is the inauguration ceremony that is testified in all of Egyptian literature. So this is the Bible sort of is doing an accurate representation here of what it would be like to be elevated to this position in Egypt. What else on page 77?
Is what I noticed too is that even though Pharaoh said the throne is the only exception, all the authority he gave Joseph, whenever Joseph, like he said, without your consent, no one shall lift a hand or a foot in all the land of Egypt, which to me is saying whatever Joseph came to Pharaoh with, Pharaoh would be in agreement. So
Yeah.
pretty much, even though he said, Joseph, I am on the throne, but
Yeah.
was actually ruling,
He's-
based on his recommendation.
He's rubber stamping everything Joseph says. Now, and we have one other indication that that's the case. What's the other indication that Joseph's word was law in Egypt? There's two indications. One is that nobody can do anything without your permission.
He gave him the signet ring.
His signet ring, yeah, that's the other key evidence there. The signet ring, we've have many pictures of signet rings from ancient Egypt on those cool paintings that Egyptians made on walls, right? With all people standing sideways, right? You see Pharaoh, you always see on his hand a signet ring, and I'm gonna draw you a picture. Pick out Danae's cool, but the signet ring kind of had an oval in the center. It's called the cartouche, and usually it had like 2 or 3 symbols on it, like that. And then on either side there was like a couple of other gold thingies, the 3 symbols in the center were representations of Pharaoh's signature. Basically, there were Egyptian characters that specifically referred to Pharaoh. They were carved into the stone, and so when Joseph dipped this in wax or dipped it in ink, he could press the signet ring down and sign Pharaoh's name to documents, right? This is blank check authority in the land of Egypt. You can see, if you look at Egyptian paintings, you see the signet ring on Pharaoh's hand. You'll also see the cartouche above his head or near his head. That's how you can tell which Pharaoh it is, because it's got his name on it. Yeah, so he's giving Joseph blank check authority in the land of Egypt. He gives him second in command. He gives him a chariot. He gives him cartouche, signet ring. He gives him new clothes. What else does he give him? A new name. Okay, yeah, Zaphanath Paneah. Zaphanath Paneah, which means God speaks and lives. God speaks and lives. Joseph somehow, through what Joseph did and said, convinced Pharaoh that God speaks and lives. Joseph was evidence of that to Pharaoh. And he gives him something else too. A wife. Yeah, if you look up who the priest of On is in Egypt, you'll find that the priest of On in Egypt at this time was considered to be among the upperest of the upper crust, right? The priest of On had a position of authority in Egypt that was over almost everybody else. There were other priests in Egypt, priests who were in the capital city were higher up than the priest of On, but not many others. So he's marrying Joseph into a tremendously powerful family. And we'll talk about this, about her and what comes from that marriage in the next passage. But this is, the definition of an arranged marriage, right? Pharaoh just, right, it seems like right on the spot, marries him into one of the most powerful families in all of Egypt. All right, so we've covered our passage, the big passage. Like we've scooted through it, I think, relatively quickly, but hopefully you're seeing the contours of this passage. We've spent time looking. Now it's time for us to listen to the passage. I'm going to erase these words because you know them by heart. Let's talk about the meaning of this passage. What does this passage mean? What is this passage trying to teach us about God, about people, about our relationship with God, about ethics? What's the theme? How do we interpret this passage? Joseph interpreted dreams. God interpreted dreams. How do we interpret the passage?
Everything happens in God's time.
Yeah, okay. Everything is God's timing. Let's do a little thought experiment. 2 years ago, the cupbearer remembers Joseph, Pharaoh. What happened? Let's say he did tell Pharaoh about a Hebrew slave in prison who can interpret dreams.
Probably would have said, so what?
Right.
I've got plenty of those.
Yeah, right. It's like snow on the ground in Rochester, not in Poughkeepsie, right? I got so many dream interpreters, I don't know what to do with it. I don't need another one. Right? But in God's timing, 2 years later, what did he need?
He needed someone who could really interpret.
Right. Even the things that seem like setbacks are under God's hand, right? Everything is happening here in God's timing. Absolutely. What is some of the themes that the passage may be teaching? What are they trying to tell us?
Be patient.
Okay, I call it a sub theme here, so be patient. That's a good application from this theme. And what else? What do you think the passage is trying to teach us?
But if God says something, it's definitely going to happen, regardless of what you know. If you get thrown in prison, you're lied on by somebody's wife. It's because a lot of, us would have, like, really, and I have to go through all of this to get there.
What God says will surely happen, or as Joseph said it to Pharaoh, he said, this thing is fixed by God and God will bring it about, right? This thing is fixed by God and God will bring it about. What God says will happen will surely happen. I got an email earlier today or yesterday, I can't remember if it was yesterday or today, from somebody in my life who sends me videos of prophecies from prophecy conferences and prophecy speakers. They're very much prophecy people. It's not somebody in the church, but it's someone from my past. And I watched the video. Someone sends me something, I do try to watch it. And the guy was talking about a prophecy that he had on just after September 11th, 2001. Right after the attacks on the World Trade Center, about what God was surely going to do. And the person said, "Isn't this encouraging?" And I said, "Well, that was 22 years ago. Yeah. If God said it, it would surely come to pass." And so I said to my friend I'm not so sure God said that. Now, Joseph waited 13 years for the interpretation of his prophecy, right? So I'm not saying it's clearly not from God, this prophecy, but what I am saying is that if it is a prophecy from God, the test of it being a prophecy from God is, does it happen, right? That's what the New Testament tells us is the test for prophecy. It's what the Old Testament tells us is the test for prophecy. If you prophesy something and it doesn't happen, it wasn't from God, right? Because what God says will surely happen. What else? Other things.
Must be something about, saving up the good times, ensuring against the bad times.
Yeah,
There's gotta be something there.
I think you're right, Sue. I think that there is a theme of the wisdom of thrift. Right, saving in the good times to provide for the bad times. In this case, God is telling Pharaoh this dream so that Pharaoh will save. Because the temptation is when good times come, you spend it all, right? And God saying, no. You don't do that now, or else everybody will die. In extraordinary times, thrift could be a lifesaver. But in ordinary times, thrift is pretty helpful too, right?
But there are a lot of people who, like for years now, they call them the doomsday, where they're like
The preppers.
prepping and
Yeah.
not even, well, not just that, now they're calling it like doing farming for yourself, sustainable living, because the time is gonna come. And I think I don't even know anything about planting anything. I'm not even good at having a plant or a flower or anything. So sometimes I'm like, oh my God, I wonder if, but then I remember what my girlfriend told me. So I said, you know what, if I can't do these things, even if I haven't saved, I know God will provide. I have to believe that if I'm not equipped at doing something when a certain time comes, or I wasn't able to prepare based on whatever was going on, that God will provide. Is that wrong to think like that?
Well, a couple of things I'd say about a good question. A couple of things I'd say about that. One is that here God is using the entire nation of Egypt together to provide for the needs of the nation. So there is a sense in which God provides through each other, right? God's going to use each of us to help provide for one another. But I definitely think that that to say, I'm just going to go my merry way and not save because somebody else will pick up the slack for me, that's not an attitude that God would encourage, right? We each of us need to work to contribute to the needs of others, right? In the ant and the grasshopper, Aesop's fable, right? Where the ants come to the grasshopper and say, help us out, help us prepare, and the grasshopper just goes around playing his fiddle and doodly do. When the hard times come, the grasshopper has nothing to eat. It's a fable that encourages thrift. If the grasshopper should have contributed to help the ants, and then when the time of difficulty comes, he would be welcomed into the ants' home, right? Now, so it's not that, on the one hand, we should recognize that we're gonna each provide for one another, right? On the other hand, we wanna do our best to help in that as well. So, I mean, many of you have experienced here at New Beginnings Church, you've experienced the benefit, I've experienced the benefit of our benevolent fund, right? At times when we get hit by some calamity or adversity, the church is here to help us. And we do that. We do it generously here at New Beginnings. Sometimes we run out of money because we've been so generous. At the beginning of last year, we were almost out of money, and we made an appeal to the church, and the church gave generously. Now we have money in the benevolent fund again. But I mean, that's the way that we're supposed to be, to provide for one another. But when you accept money out of the benevolent funds, one of the things we talked to you about is, all right, let's start a plan so you can get to the point where don't need that anymore, and you can actually contribute to the needs of others, because that's how godly thrift works. We do rely on others, but we also are contributing to help meet the needs of others. So yeah, good stuff. What else? Anything else? Help me with the one that I'm sort of floating around in my head and I can't really put it into words is this idea that God is God and Pharaoh is not. How would you word that kind of a theme out of this passage?
Well, God is God and we're not.
Okay. It strikes me that this is the most powerful man on earth at the time, right? Pharaoh is the most powerful man on earth in that day. He is the person in charge of the world's most powerful nation, and he comes up against the limits of his abilities, right? He is not sufficient to the task, but God is.
Yeah, and a good thing to remember, because there's a lot of times when people lift other people up to the status of being a god,
Yeah.
like sports figures or political figures or heads of countries,
Right.
things like that. And you have to remember not to do that.
Right, very good. Yeah.
And also, it has been told, even though Pharaoh didn't believe in God, coming face to face with Joseph, I don't know if before he had heard, but certainly Joseph
Yeah.
and the Israelites were taught that God is God, he's supreme.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, because also the Israelites, they were like, Moses was the leader at one time, they were always leaders or somebody above the others, but they always knew, because if you remember, which was I think the reason why Moses didn't get into the promised land, the striking of the rock and the water, because had the people believed that he was the one who actually, it was within his power to do it.
Yeah.
So just like Sue said, he said, lift people up. But Pharaoh, I think, also had to be shown his limitations. Which is
Exactly.
why I think his magicians were confounded and not able to do anything.
Yeah.
He had to know that, like, I'm limited, no
Yeah.
matter how high my throne is or what I have,
Yeah.
I am still limited.
In my sermon on Sunday, I'm going to be preaching a little bit about that. Our sermon this upcoming Sunday is, yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever, right? And here's just a little preview, right? That there's a lot of leaders out there that just think they're the bee's knees, right? And that the sun rises and sets at their command, but God is the one who raises up kings. God is the one who puts kings down. And Psalms says, trust not in princes, right? Pharaoh needed to be shown who he was in relation to God.
He'd have to let himself be humbled before God. to
Yeah.
follow him.
Yeah. Amen. And to my mind, and I could be wrong, but how I interpret this passage is that it works, right? I mean, I'm not saying that Pharaoh, became a worshiper of God, but certainly I feel like in the name that he gives Joseph, in the recognition that in Joseph is the Spirit of God, Pharaoh comes to a point of recognizing a power greater than himself, at the very least. And I take that as a really positive thing. And then there'll be more of this to come. So there's more indications of Pharaoh's humility before God in the stories that are following. So keep an eye out for that. Keep an eye out for Pharaoh's spiritual journey. It's a tiny little theme, but it is there, and that will be actually key to the book of Exodus as well.
That's what I was like, is it the same Pharaoh that, or was it another one?
Now, see that in fact, in Exodus, it explicitly says there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Right?
Okay, good.
There arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and I'm planning on preaching through Exodus this year, starting this year, and we'll get there, right? That here now we'll be coming to a Pharaoh who is not a God follower in any way.
And this one found respect for God.
Yeah,
He respected Joseph's God.
which gives me some hope for even our leaders. Let's take a minute now. We move from looking to listening. Now we're going to ask the question, how should we live as a result of this? What is it that God is saying to you from this passage? Why did God want you to hear this word tonight? I want you to take 2 minutes, prayerfully listen to God. And if God says something specific to you, write it down. We'll talk about it afterwards. All right. So as always, I don't want to push anybody into sharing whatever God says to you is between you and God, but if God said something to you that you'd like to share, it could be a blessing to other people. So has anybody, what has God said to anybody here who would like to share?
When it comes back to the faithfulness of God, He promised and He's faithful to do what He promised.
Yeah, if you couldn't hear that online, Nicole was saying that it comes back to the faithfulness of God, that God is faithful. If He says something, He will do it. He'll do what He promised. Amen. Somebody else.
I think it also says that God is faithful in whatever circumstances we are, even if He isn't changing our circumstances. And even if we don't feel that he's with us, he is there with us. He is faithful.
Amen. Amen. Yeah. God is faithful even when it doesn't seem like it. Even when our circumstances don't seem like it. For me, I was powerfully moved by the observation that that everything is happening here in God's time. This idea that the cupbearer, even the cupbearer forgetting Joseph was part of God's plan. And we talked about this back when Joseph went looking for his brothers, and they had gone on, and if he had not run into that guy who told him where they were, he never would have been sold into Egypt, you know. And it's like all these little things that are there that God brings about. And again, it's going to tie into the sermon this Sunday. The sermon is fresh in my mind because I'm writing it, but God is sovereign, and every one of us, I'll wager, has had divine appointments. I was talking with a guy. Actually, we're on Facebook. I'm going to tell this story on Sunday, so act surprised. But the men's 40 days of prayer men's group on Facebook, one of our members, Travis, was talking about how, one night he was praying, one night last week he was praying, this week he was praying to God and saying, God, I need you to speak to me. Where do you want me? What do you want me to read in the Bible? And God pointed him to the Psalms, and he was looking through the Psalms, and God was saying, I'm going to read Psalm 23, and he read Psalm 23, and it really spoke to him. And then he went to bed, and the next morning he woke up, and that was the devotional for the next day on the 40 days of prayer, and he's like, I just can't believe what God did, and that's such a small thing in the grand scheme of things, but every one of us has had that kind of experience, right? Where God directs us to the word, and it's the word for today. Or where somebody gets put on your heart that you haven't seen for 10 years, and you pray for them, and then the phone rings and it's them, and they're in need, and you're like, I just prayed for you, and that was God doing that. Like people say, oh, that's a coincidence, but coincidences happen all the time when you pray, it's this amazing thing that God's timing is phenomenal.
Yeah, I think there aren't any coincidences, and when you recognize God's timing, when you recognize things are happening, it's amazing.
Yeah,
I feel like that's happening now in my life.
Yeah,
Me too.
And just simple things that happened over the weekend, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the beginning of, I think it's going to be like major changes, which will be so good. I've been praying forever, and regarding my son, and this is just incredible. People that he just came in touch with, and he just thought it was random.
yeah,
I mean, it's like, oh my gosh.
yeah.
But I'm like, how did that happen?
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
I mean,
God does amazing things. I'm sure there's others that we could share, and there's plenty more that I'm sure that God's been speaking to you, but I want to honor our time and bring this to a close. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. Thank you that you are a God who speaks in words. You're a God who speaks in the circumstances of life. You orchestrate things, you orchestrate coincidences to happen in such a way that we can see your hand at work with eyes of faith. You're often not blatant, so that someone who wants to disbelieve can still disbelieve. But you give plenty of evidence that folks with eyes of faith can see your hand at work every day in our lives. Lord, thank you that your timing is always good. Thank you that when you make a promise, you do keep it. Thank you that you enable us to have plenty and save in order to provide for the lean years. And thank you that you allow us to provide for others. But help us to both rely on the provision that you would give through others and also contribute to the provision that you give to others, make for others. And Lord, I thank you for the constant reminder that you are God and that we are not, that we don't have the wisdom or the power to govern our lives or our nation or our world, but you do. And so Lord, we are wise if we trust you. So help us to trust you. In Jesus' name. Amen. All right, our next passage is going to start on page 77, line 7. 77, line 7. It's a short one. I think we're going to end on 78, line 2. Or 78, let's say 78, line 9. 78, line 9. It's the tricky thing is that the next passage after that will be very long. So it's tricky to make this all work. I'm trying to give you a thought unit. Let's go to 78, line 9. The famine was in the land of Canaan, period. That's the end. The beginning of the passage after that will be now Joseph was governor over the land.
So we stop at Canaan.
Stop at Canaan.
Okay.
All right, and if you can, please spend some time looking through that passage. The more time you spend, the more fruitful our study will be next Wednesday. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Zoomers. I'm going to stop the recording.